Welcome, everyone. I'm your host for today's webinar, Mike Lasecki. Our topic is Walking the NSF Budgeting Walk. Details about NSF ATE proposal budget and budget justification. Please remember that this event is being recorded. I've turned on the recording button, and please use the chat window. We'll have a number of breaks. On this slide, you'll see our acknowledgement to the sponsor, ATE Central, for this webinar. ATE Central is the information hub for the ATE community. And please visit their website for all things related to ATE at atecentral.net. Thanks, ATE Central. On the next slide, it's my pleasure now to introduce our lead presenter, Elaine Kraft, who is the principal investigator of the Mentor Connect effort. Welcome, Elaine. Please say hello to everyone and introduce your co-presenters.
Thank you, Mike. Welcome, everyone. As Mike said, I am Elaine Kraft, Principal Investigator for Mentor Connect. Mentor Connect is a special NSF ATE project based at Florence Darlington Technical College in Florence, South Carolina. My Mentor Connect co-presenters for today's webinar are co-principal investigators Ellen Haas from the American Association of Community Colleges, and Emery DeWitt of Florence Darlington Technical College. Emery also serves as project manager for Mentor Connect. As we begin this webinar, please know that Mentor Connect does not speak on behalf of the National Science Foundation. During this technical support webinar, we will be sharing information extracted from NSF publications, as well as from our own experience and communications with NSF program officers and grantees. The opinions we express are our own. A special thank you to our technology and webinar support team at ATE Central and Luca Partners, who are facilitating today's broadcast. I also want to acknowledge support from other members of our Mentor Connect team, whose work helps Mentor Connect possible. Today, we will provide line-by-line instructions and advice for completing a budget for your ATE proposal. We will also cover how to prepare a good budget justification. You will have opportunities throughout the webinar to ask questions. The slides from today's webinar will be available to you within a couple of days following the broadcast. We will conclude today's broadcast by asking you to complete a very brief evaluation survey. The information you provide will help us improve this Mentor Connect technical assistance webinar, and also provides essential data needed for reporting to the National Science Foundation. If you are not currently a Mentor Connect participant, you might wonder why we provide this type of technical assistance to potential NSF ATE grantees. Mentor Connect project objectives are briefly stated on this slide. A primary goal for Mentor Connect is to help more of the nation's two-year technical and community colleges benefit from NSF ATE funding. We provide several types of mentoring to support two-year technical and community colleges as they seek NSF ATE funding to support and advance the preparation of technicians and advanced technologies that drive the American economy. Diversifying the ATE program and growing STEM faculty leaders are also Mentor Connect goals. Today, we want you to learn how to correctly complete an NSF budget form, how to prepare a budget justification, why a good budget helps make a good proposal, how you can avoid common errors, and where you can find budgeting answers and other help along the way to becoming an ATE grantee. I want to alert you to a couple of considerations related to budget preparation and proposal submission. First is the online system you will be working in to submit your proposal. The online system provided by NSF is preferred. FastLane is the NSF system in current use. FastLane is in the process of being replaced by research.gov. Until that transition is complete, FastLane will be available, and FastLane is the system that we recommend for those of you working on proposals for October 2021 submission. Beginning in 2022, FastLane will have been replaced and completely phased out, and research.gov will be the NSF system to use for proposal submission, proposal-related activities, and reporting. Some functions are handled by research.gov now, and principal investigators are seamlessly transferred from FastLane to research.gov or vice versa as they work. Grant writers in the audience and perhaps others will be aware of and perhaps adept at using another online grant submission system called grants.gov. Grants.gov may be used to submit NSF grant proposals. However, we do not recommend that you do so. Grants.gov is used by federal agencies other than NSF. While it is permissible to submit grant proposals using grants.gov, we strongly encourage you to use the NSF system for submitting NSF grant proposals. I'll tell you why. If grants.gov is used, there are extra steps you must take for a proposal to be complete and successfully transferred from grants.gov to NSF. There is a time lag associated with this transmission, and you can't be certain when a proposal will be received by NSF. Grants.gov does not enforce NSF proposal deadlines and will actually accept proposals on the final day after the NSF deadline. Grants.gov will accept a proposal that is not complete. Proposals that arrive at NSF late for any reason will not be reviewed. In addition, certain forms that are required for NSF proposals are not supported by grants.gov. These forms must be submitted separately to NSF using FastLane. The proposals received by NSF without the required forms are returned without review. The NSF system has compliance checks that help ensure that your proposal is complete, whereas grants.gov does not. These are just some of the reasons why we encourage you to use the system NSF provides for submitting grant proposals. In addition, the help desk for FastLane and research.gov works really well. Real people are there to help you resolve any issues you may encounter. Mentor Connect is also available to help you with proposal submission. Another important consideration to keep in mind as you begin working on the proposal budget is the NSF policy on cost sharing. Cost sharing is expressly prohibited for NSF ATE proposals. You will want to be very careful throughout your proposal that you do not include anything that may be considered cost sharing. We will talk more about this particularly as we discuss indirect costs and during the forms webinar in May. Now, on to the actual budget preparation. The budget form is a template to be completed within the online proposal submission function in FastLane. The information you enter into this form automatically becomes part of your overall NSF grant proposal. The budget section of FastLane automatically generates year-by-year budget template to be completed. Within the form, totals are calculated by budget category and by year. Once budget forms are completed for each year of the proposal, an automated system generates a cumulative budget for the proposal. The budget justification, however, is not a template. You will need to develop this document from scratch to explain and provide details about the amounts entered into the budget form and how they relate to your project plan. The budget justification is uploaded as a separate document to support your proposal. The key thing to remember is that your budget should clearly and specifically align with the scope of work of the project. There should be a very clear link between the money being requested and what you are requesting the money to support. The budget and work plan should support one another. In other words, they should be codependent. The budget will enable the project to be implemented as planned. The project outlines work for which funding is needed for implementation. The two work in concert. I will refer to the essential codependency between the project plan and the requested budget throughout this webinar. Many parts of an NSF proposal are codependent. Correlation and consistency throughout is very important. Now, as we get started, let's find out how much experience you've had with NSF budgets. So if you will select the answer that best describes you, then Mike will let us know what the totals look like.
Answers are streaming in, Elaine. Let's just give them a minute.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks, we'll do a countdown and then we'll end the poll and take a look at the results. Here's your countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Elaine, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Let's take a look at the results. Just a second here. So there's our results, Elaine.
Oh, okay. It looks like we have a good mix of experience in the audience today. And whether you are a budget veteran or this is all brand new to you, we hope this webinar will broaden your understanding of budget and budget justification preparation. The handout for today's webinar includes information about fast lane access and includes a tutorial for initiating a proposal and accessing the budget section. A link to the handout is provided in chat box. And it will be distributed to those who have registered for this webinar. At this time, I will fast forward into the budget preparation point in this process. Once a proposal has been initiated, you will have access to all proposal sections, including the budget. In developing a proposal budget, it is a good idea to start by setting up a spreadsheet and working out the budget there first. Once you have a straw man budget drafted, you should turn to your budget justification. Working between your budget spreadsheet and budget justification will be a back and forth process as you obtain more precise cost information and think through the details of personnel time and other expenses. All the while, you need to keep an eye on the budget bottom line. Invariably, numbers and information will need to be modified on each document as you complete the budget development process. If you use formulas and keep good notes as you develop your spreadsheet, you will find it much easier to make modifications as you go along. When you complete or you're nearly complete, you will transfer the numbers from this work into the budget template. The budget justification will be uploaded as a separate PDF document. Once you are ready to enter information into the budget template, you will notice that each section is activated by clicking on a Go button. And on the slides, you'll see red arrows pointing to the items that I'm talking about. When you're completing the budget template, the first step is to select funds for year one. You will notice that this is also the screen where you will upload your budget justification. You'll notice that red arrow on the left. There are options provided when working on this page that are helpful. For example, if your budget will be very similar from year to year, you have the option of having the information from one year transferred to the budget form for the next year. If you do this, however, be very careful to make all edits that are applicable to the next year's work. Also remember the codependency I talked about and keep the budget request perfectly aligned with your budget justification. Realistic budgets are rarely identical from year to year, but rather they change somewhat as the project progresses and activities and anticipated costs change. The budget for each year begins with personnel costs. First is senior personnel, Section A of the budget. This slide provides a hypothetical example. So who are senior personnel? Senior personnel for budget development includes only individuals who are employed by your institution who serve as principal investigator, co-principal investigator, or in another significant leadership role for the project, and who will receive compensation from the grant. Keep these two criteria in mind. Individuals in this section of the budget must work for the grantee institution and they must receive compensation from the grant. It is possible to have individuals who serve in these roles who are not compensated. It is also possible to have individuals serving in these roles who are from another institution or organization. Compensation for anyone working on the project who is not an employee of the grantee institution should be included in a different section of the budget. In sections A through C of the budget, you should only include the people who are employed by your institution who will receive compensation. We will tell you how to include these other individuals a little bit later. For now, make a note that they do not belong in this section of your budget if they don't work for your institution. Another point that I've been asked to stress is that an institutional grant writer should not be among those listed as senior personnel on the budget, even if the individual will contribute to the work of the grant. During the Forms webinar on May 7th, we will explain how to include other supporting individuals such as grant administrator or student recruiter in your proposal. Now, back to completing the budget template. You don't actually enter names in the template, but rather you select names from a list of those who have been previously registered for your institution. You may only select individuals that have been pre-registered in FastLane. You can add or delete individuals selected for each year of the budget. This is just one of the many good reasons for not doing your budget work at the last minute. If you discover that a person you need to have named in the budget isn't registered, it takes time to get that person registered in FastLane. Also, only someone with FastLane administrative permission at your institution can register a new person. The same thing is true for subawards. For an organization to receive a subaward from your grant, the organization must be registered in FastLane. In addition, all senior personnel included in the subawardees budget, which is separate from their main project budget, must be registered in FastLane by that organization. These are definitely not last-minute tasks. My advice is that if you have multiple people that you are considering including in your budget, or multiple organizations perhaps, register all of them. When you prepare the budget, you select only the ones you want to include. You can also deselect a name if your plans change. So don't delay in registering personnel in FastLane because you're not yet sure exactly who will be included in your budget. One last thing to note on this slide, a calculate option appears at the end of each budget section. It is helpful to calculate as you go along so that you can keep an eye on budget section totals. Be aware, however, that the calculate function does not save your information should you exit the system. I will show you where you have the option to save your work. This slide shows the very important save command. There is only one save command key on the budget form, and it is way at the bottom of the page. After each section of information is entered, scroll all the way to the bottom to section L and save. If you do this, you can come back to the budget at any time and previously entered information will be waiting for you. Forget, and you get to start all over again. Guess how I know that? Experience is a great teacher. Now I will walk you through more of the budget form sections. On this slide, you see an actual budget form. On the left, the NSF budget categories are listed. This alphabetical and numerical outline is important. We strongly recommend that you use this outline in the alphabetical order presented as an organizing tool when you prepare your budget spreadsheet and your budget justification. Both reviewers and program officers appreciate a budget justification that is organized this way. A little later, I will show you an example of how to do this. NSF budget categories will differ from budgets you work with at your college. It is important to understand how NSF defines each category of expense so that you can develop and submit your budget accordingly. Once funded, you will need to work with your business office to develop a clear crosswalk between the NSF budget categories and the budget accounting codes that will be used by your college. Now, let's look at each budget category. As you can see, there are two personnel sections, Section A, Senior Personnel, and Section B, Other Personnel. A separate Section C is provided for including fringe benefits that are associated with personnel costs at your institution. NSF requires you to include these costs. Once again, let's look at the sample budget allocation for Category A, Senior Personnel. Note the horizontal red arrow near the bottom of the slide. This is where you will add or delete individuals in this section. In general, individuals in senior personnel roles should be receiving some financial support to conduct the work of the project and help ensure its success. However, if you have a person serving in a senior personnel role who will not receive money from the grant, the individual should not be included on the budget page. Do not include anyone for whom the budget entry will be $0. It is important that the amount you budget for an individual align with the institutional salaries or pay rates for that individual and with institutional policies and procedures for compensation. An individual may not be paid more or less than their normal compensation from the institution for comparable time and work. Ideally, no individual will be budgeted to receive more than 100% of his or her full salary in a given time period, such as a semester. It is important that those working on grants have a reasonable amount of compensated time dedicated to this work. However, overload pay for faculty and community colleges is prevalent, and NSF supports institutional practice in that regard. No faculty member or other employee should experience a pay reduction while working on a grant. This means that a faculty member who routinely teaches an overload may substitute overload teaching work with grant work to maintain his or her customary compensation. Or a faculty member may be paid extra for taking on grant work in addition to a full-time teaching load, as long as college policy and procedure for this additional overload pay are followed. If an individual will be receiving overload pay for teaching or completing grant work, this overload pay must be explained in the budget justification. In addition, information about the college's compensation policies and procedures for overload pay must also be referred to in that budget justification. The rule is that an institution's policy and procedures governing overload compensation should apply to other types of overload or extra pay for college employees, such as teaching overload. The policy and procedure should not be specific only to a person working on a grant funded by NSF. Specific language from NSF about overload pay may be found in MentorConnect online resources. Information in the budget and in the proposal need to match. The time allocation for anyone in a senior personnel role for the project will be reported multiple times in the grant proposal. It is important that this information that you provide be consistent with each reporting. For example, senior personnel will be named in the project description, and the time each person will devote to the project will appear in at least 3 places in your proposal: on current and pending support forms, in the budget, and in the budget justification. It is easy to get tripped up as you finalize your budget, so be careful and consistent by checking and rechecking other places throughout the proposal where this information appears, especially when you make changes. When you allocate funds to support personnel, you need to be reasonable and very specific, both within the proposal and in your budget justification, about the work the individual will be doing for that compensation. It is never good if an individual appears to reviewers to be overcompensated for too little work, as outlined in the project description. Likewise, reviewers worry if there is too little compensation for an extensive scope of work. Principal investigators are expected to be compensated for their project work time, either with direct financial support or with release time. Because time and compensation calculations are an area where reviewers and program officers often find errors, I want to provide a couple of very specific examples to help you do this right. Before I talk you through this example, I would like to note a couple of things. First, if you carefully read the NSF guidelines in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide that we refer to as the PAPPG, you will see a reference to a 2-month limit on faculty time. However, for ATE projects, faculty are not limited to 2 summer months. However, but requested time must be well justified, as is the case with all other expenses included in your budget. Explaining the scope of work for each budgeted faculty member is expected. Even so, you should discuss any personnel support that is outside the NSF PAPPG guidelines with a program officer before submitting your proposal. Also at this time, faculty time should be reported as academic and/or summer months, not calendar months, even if the faculty member has a 12-month contract. If teaching contracts are 12-month contracts at your institution and reporting faculty time in calendar months is appropriate for your situation, this will be a little different than the average, so you should explain this in your budget justification. In this first example, we will assume that the principal investigator is a faculty member whose 9-month or academic year contract is $54,000. This faculty member plans to spend the equivalent of 1 day per 5-day week working on the project during fall and spring semesters. In addition, he or she will work full-time on the grant for the equivalent of 2 months in the summer. During the academic year, this work plan calls for 1/5 or 20% of the person's time. In this example, we will assume that this equates to 1 course release time for a faculty member who typically teaches 5 courses per semester. This typical faculty teaching load may differ at your institution. Whatever your situation, you will want to calculate the percentages and equivalents based on your college's faculty loading practices. You will prorate your budget request accordingly. Even if a faculty member will be working on a grant all year long, don't report this time as 12 months in the budget. The time you should include is the fraction of that person's total work time that will be supported by NSF funds. To do this calculation, you will need the person's salary per month and the number of academic months that equate to the planned amount of release time or salary support. For summertime, you just need to know what the monthly salary rate will be that you can apply. The time calculation in this example gives us 1.8 academic months for the faculty member's time in fall and spring semesters. To this amount, you want to add 2 months salary for summer work. What makes this tricky is that you will indicate the faculty member's person months separately by academic months and summer months, whereas the budget dollar request will be the sum of the two. The picture insert on this slide shows how to report academic and summer months. The calendar box is left blank. You should never put a number in the calendar month box when reporting academic or summer months, or vice versa. Now let's look at a different example. This time we are looking at an individual who is not a faculty member and works on a 12-month contract at the college. The person's 12-month salary is $40,000 in this example. If a monthly salary for a person is not available, obviously you can just divide the annual salary by 12 to determine the monthly amount to use. The person's time commitment to the project will be 1 day per 5-day week year-round, or 20% of his or her time. The first step is to determine the equivalent number of calendar months. In this case, 20% equals 2.4 months. The monthly salary amount is multiplied by 2.4 to provide the budget request per year. Time for an employee who is not faculty should be reported as calendar months. The picture insert on this slide shows how to report a person's time. Fight the urge to put a number in every box. You should never mix calendar months with the other two categories when reporting a person's time. If you put a number in the calendar box, leave the other two blank. Also, since the template only accommodates one decimal place for reporting calendar months, rounding will likely be necessary. Now let's check to see if you're still awake. Find the calculator on your cell phone if you need to, because we have a quiz for you, and we will ask Mike and the Luca team to help us with this. So we want to know how many person months you should report for a faculty member who will have 30% release time during a 9-month academic year.
We're already getting some answers, Elaine. They were poised over their calculators.
I tell you, that concept of person months is a really strange one.
It really is.
It's just not the way we think. And so one of the resources that we have available for our audience today is a spreadsheet tool that helps you convert time into these person months that NSF uses for their reporting. And the link to that tool will be in the chat box for everybody to access, so that you will have that tool to help you with this task when you're doing your budget.
You know, if you make a mistake while you're entering into Fastlane, you can just correct it, right? There's no problem until
that's correct. And until that proposal is submitted to NSF, it is a draft form and can be modified anytime you go into the system.
Cool. That was one of our questions. Let's go ahead, Elaine. I'm going to end the poll. Everyone's got their answers in. I'll count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here, let's take a look at the results, Elaine. Here they are.
Okay, well, we have a very alert audience today, Mike. The correct answer is 2.7 academic months, which is 30% of 9 months. And that's the way you would calculate that. Thanks, everybody, for participating in that quiz. As you can see from this photo of the actual budget form, the other personnel section includes several categories that are not likely to be applicable to an NSF ATE grant, such as postdoctoral scholars. You may, however, have other professionals who will be compensated to help you with your project. This category is most often used for such jobs as lab assistant, project coordinator, software, web page developer, or other technical support personnel at your college. Adjunct faculty fit into this category too, if the college will pay adjunct faculty to provide faculty with release time. The faculty that are working on the grant get the release time. In the other personnel section, it is not necessary to name the person who will do the work. If you know who will do the work, include the name on your budget justification. Whether you name the individual or not, the scope of work for any position that is included should be described in the budget justification, along with details about the time the person will work and the compensation that is associated with that time. Secretarial or clerical support can be included only in very limited special circumstances. In most cases, indirect costs are designed to cover this expense. To be eligible, the work must clearly support the work of the grant and be distinct and distinguishable from functions that are normally performed by the college. You can check out the specifics in the NSF PAPPG, Chapter 2, Subpart C, Subsection G, that addresses budget and budget justification. Note that students are typically paid hourly rates. Paid time for students is capped at 20 hours a week during the academic year and 40 hours a week in the summer. Once you have entered all personnel salaries and wages, next you will determine fringe benefits for the requested salaries and wages. On this slide, you can see that you insert only one number for total fringe benefits on the salaries and wages that you included in sections A and B. An explanation of your fringe benefit request should be included in your budget justification, clearly stating the fringe benefit rate that is used and how it was determined. You're likely to use an average percent when entering fringe benefits, as the template only accommodates the total amount of personnel compensation for the year and a single percentage for which the total fringe benefit amount is automatically calculated by the FastLane system. Fringe benefit expense for an individual should be prorated based on the percent of the person's time being supported by the grant. If the grant is supporting 10% of a person's salary, then it should be supporting 10% of the fringe benefits for the individual as well. This slide points out that all personnel except graduate students should be included in your fringe benefit calculation. Now, Mike, let's take a break and answer some of our audience questions.
Thank you, Elaine. Colleagues, I'd like to ask a favor. We're very interested in sharing your questions with all the attendees. The problem is the chat window, that little thing there, it defaults to panelists only. So if you select panelists and attendees, all of us will be able to see your questions. Elaine, will you, or rather, Emery, toggle back to slide 20. We have a couple of specific questions. Go back to 20. Okay, here's the first one, Elaine. What if you have a faculty member who's not going to fulfill a senior role, a senior personnel role? Maybe they're doing some mentoring. Where would you put them in the grant, in the budget?
They can be in your other personnel section.
So right
again, the detail that you can provide on these budget forms is very limited. That's why the budget justification is so important.
Okay.
But if you put a faculty member that is going to be a mentor, for instance, in the other personnel section, then in your budget justification, you can explain that it is a faculty member, that they're going to be a mentor, how much time they're going to spend doing this and what they're going to be compensated for that.
Good. So you place them here, but the details in the justification. Second, similar question. How do you enter the time, if your college's IT department to install hardware or software that's purchased through the grant? How do you manage that?
There are a couple of ways to do that, depending on how your college would charge you for that work. If you are able to pay an individual
yes,
to do that work, then you would put that in the other personnel section. If your college bills you at some sort of departmental rate, in other words, they charge for a specific service, and they have a rate schedule for what they charge for those services in similar situations, then it would go under a different section of the budget. It goes under other direct cost, and there's a place there for like computer type
okay,
expenses.
All right, good. Now, in a more general question, one of our attendees, their dean wants to be part of this proposal. The dean wants to be on the budget for $0. Is that okay? What should they do?
You can't name them in the budget. They can be in a senior personnel role. You describe them as such in your proposal, and then we'll be talking later, particularly during the forms webinar, about a facilities, equipment, and other resources form that goes with your proposal. And that form gives you an opportunity to talk about people who are going to contribute to the work of your grant that are not going to be compensated for that. They're essentially doing it as part of their regular job, but they do have a significant contribution to make to the work of this project. You just don't name them in the budget.
Okay, that makes sense. We're going to have to convey that message to the dean and saying, too bad.
Can't be in the budget if you're not going to get any money. That's right.
So here's a good one from one of our colleagues. They have a partner school that's considering a collaborative proposal, right? One that there's a separate application, a separate budget, and then they're linked together. Do you think they should do that or just go in the same proposal together?
There are pros and cons to doing collaboratives. The advantage to a collaborative is that both institutions essentially are awardees. They become grantee institutions. Each has its own budget and controls that budget. They do put it the same proposal in terms of the scope of work and that sort of thing. You don't have any control over the other entity in reality. And so I would, you only want to go into a collaborative with someone you have a great deal of confidence that they're going to hold up their end of the bargain, they're going to do their part of the work, that they're going to submit their reports on time, and that they are going to be extremely responsible partners in the endeavor. We have seen collaboratives for small grants for institutions new to AT in a situation where a university was partnering with a two-year college. At universities, the faculty and departments it's part of their reward system to get grants and to be the principal investigators and to have those awards made to those institutions. And this university wanted that credit, and the faculty member there wanted that credit. So even though it was a very small collaborative from their perspective, the dollar amount that they got for that collaborative was small. It achieved their objectives of getting the recognition. Now, another thing for colleges, two-year colleges to think about in this is if you're partnering, whoever the grantee institution is essentially getting the credit for the grant. Yep. That partner institution, if it is a collaborative, will no longer be eligible for their own small grant for institutions new to ATE. That will make them a grantee, and so they will not have that eligibility anymore. So they may just want to be a sub-award in somebody else's, which does not jeopardize that eligibility. Then they can go for their own standalone that would be there. It's a little bit complicated. For somebody who's really thinking about this, feel free to call the Mentor Connect help desk, and we'll be glad to talk through the pros and cons with you and help you make a decision about that.
Good.
But they're both viable routes. It's an unusual arrangement for a small grant for institutions new to AT.
All right. Thank you, Elaine. One last question for this period, and then we'll turn to some other ones later on, the question breaks. But here's the one, and it's a reasonable question. Should we put in some money for miscellaneous unexpected expenses, like put in $5K just in case we need it? Is that a reasonable approach, and where would you do it?
Absolutely not.
Okay, that's very clear.
One of the pieces of advice that I was given very early on, and Mike and I both go back in the AT program now, about 28 years.
Yep.
Was a very savvy person told me early on that NSF does not fund, etc.
Oh,
so, and that always stuck with me. No, you really can't. And they don't even like big, broad guesstimates, $5,000 for materials and supplies. They will know exactly what it is you think you're going to need. Now, if you put down that you need these 6 things and you start working on your project and you need only 4 of those, and then you need 2 other things, but not 2 of the things you listed, you can switch those things out later, but they really want you to be specific about what you think you're going to need at the time and not just put money in there just in case.
Okay, good. We have a number of other questions, Elaine, but we're going to hold them for our next period. Let's move forward in the webinar now.
Okay, Ellen is going to take us forward.
Great, thank you, Elaine. So speaking about other things to budget, we can move forward to equipment. So NSF allows you to budget for equipment and instrumentation costs, such as laboratory, field instrumentation, and scientific or industrial machinery, provided that the items are necessary to support your grant activities and are not otherwise available and accessible. So keep in mind that you'll need to justify any equipment you are purchasing for the grant in terms of student use and learning outcomes. And in addition, any equipment purchased with grant funds must have a service life of over 1 year. So in budgeting equipment, if you look at the form on the screen, you'll see that this category is where you would list single items of equipment with an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So in addition to the price of equipment, be sure to factor in the cost of any modifications, attachments, or accessories needed to make that equipment usable for its intended purposes. And that's how you would come up with that total acquisition cost. So as an example, if you're purchasing a piece of machinery that costs $4,000, but you need 2 attachments that cost $500 each to make it usable, that would bring your total acquisition cost for this piece of equipment to $5,000. So it would be budgeted here. As another example, if you're purchasing laboratory equipment or GPS units or some other instrumentation that individually costs less than $5,000, then that would be budgeted under materials and supplies, and we'll cover that shortly. The most important consideration for those applying for grants that are small, new to ATE is that your equipment costs should be relative to and fit within that overall scope of your budget. So including a budget that requests funds for equipment that takes up all or most of your budget would certainly not be advisable. And in addition to budgeting reasonably for equipment costs and justifying those costs as to why they're needed for your project, equipment must be acquired in accordance with your college's organizational practice. So do note how your college classifies equipment will likely differ from how NSF classifies it. Your college may consider all instrumentation, regardless of cost, to be classified as equipment. However, you will need to go by NSF's definition of equipment when budgeting for your grant. Also, when constructing for your budget, NSF expects that you'll ask for any available educational discounts from equipment suppliers. Some may offer discounts, and you can apply the actual cost of the equipment to your budget, as well as document the discount as part of your budget justification. Okay, and a quick take on what equipment is not. So NSF funds cannot be used to support costs that would normally be made available if you didn't have a grant, such as laboratory upgrades or routine teaching activities. It cannot be used for teaching aids, such as film projectors or whiteboards, nor can it be used for general utility items, such as office equipment or office furniture. Again, most importantly, all equipment costs will need to be detailed in your budget justification, which includes addressing why you need this equipment, who will be using it, and how it will be used. Okay, moving on to travel, hopefully in a world where travel is free and open again. This travel line is only to be used to budget for travel costs for project staff or college personnel that may not be project staff but are traveling to help accomplish your project objectives, such as faculty members that need to attend a professional development meeting or to be able to test project-generated materials in their classes. So you would not budget for travel of advisory committee members, speakers, or consultants under this category. Only project staff and college personnel traveling for the project. So you may include only travel necessary to accomplish project objectives. So for example, funds can be requested for field work, attendance at meetings and conferences, and other travel associated with the proposed scope of work. Attendance at meetings or conferences must be necessary to accomplish proposal objectives or to disseminate your grant results. When budgeting, most institutions have their own guidelines on mileage rates and per diem, and NSF accepts these, as the budgeted travel allowance should be consistent with your organizational practices as administrators of the grant. However, do note some restrictions on travel. You must book the most economical form of travel, such as economy class airfare. If your project requires international travel, which is not likely in small new to ATE, you would need to budget for travel on US carriers. And travel expenses must be reasonable in terms of the number of trips and the amount budgeted for each one. You'll also need to detail your travel expenses in terms of why this travel is necessary and include as accurate travel estimates in your budget justification. So for example, if you're budgeting to attend a hopeful in-person conference soon, you'll need to include the actual hotel rates for how many dates of attendance, search airfares for your time frame of traveling and include them, and be sure to budget for meals and ground transportation costs. So you'll want to estimate as best as possible. And a very important consideration is that it's unallowable to use federal funds for alcohol or for entertainment costs. So you'll want to be sure not to include those in your budget. Okay, the ATE conference, the ATE program solicitation is not out, but it typically requires that you budget travel expenses to attend the annual National ATE Principal Investigators Conference, which is held each year in October in Washington, D.C. If you are applying for an ATE grant in October of 2021 and funded, you would be expected to attend the 2022 ATE conference. So we're trying to project to help you budget for 2022. We anticipate that we would want you to include funds for at least 2 team members to attend the annual PI conference for each year of the grant. Do note that AACC provides some assistance for the ATE conference. We cover the cost of registration and 2 nights lodging for 2 people per ATE project or center. So you're going to want to consider budgeting airfare and other travel costs to from Washington, D.C. for 2 team members to attend, such as meals that are not offered by the event, ground transportation costs, or any additional nights you might need if you're coming in early to attend a pre-conference workshop and need additional nights, such as you're from the West Coast, you would want to include that in your budget. So on the slide, the 2022 ATE conference is October 26 to 28. The hotel rate to include in your budget if you need nights beyond the 2 that are offered by AACC is listed at $273 per night. And if you want to bring more than 2 people from your grant, that's something you would really need to strongly justify or plan to use institutional funds to support additional team members. So any additional team members above the 2 that AACC covers would be required to pay a registration fee and cover their own lodging costs. Please note that the AT conference and parameters around registration, we're still in a little bit of flux as we're trying to figure out 2021. We hope to have returned to a normal or a new normal in 2022. So for now, we do recommend budgeting for costs for 2 team members to attend. And detailed information is typically on AACC's website July 1 for that year, and we'll certainly share updates as we have it. And just so you know, certainly in 2021 and beyond, we will be including a virtual track in all conferences, even those that are in person. So team members that can't travel can be accommodated in attending certain portions of the event. And certainly if we're dealing with capacity restrictions in the future, having a virtual track will enable more team members to attend as well. All right, moving on to participant support. So if your college is planning to host conferences, meetings, training workshops, or other short-term instructional or information sharing activities as part of your scope of work, the cost to support those participants or those trainees would be budgeted under this category. Participant support costs can be used for stipends, travel, and other related costs to support attendance at workshops or conferences. And it's important to distinguish between participants and project staff. Participants are not employees. They are individuals who are recipients of a service or training provided by your college's NSF-funded event or training activity. And while participants perform no direct work for the project, they are a vital part of your grant activities, and they can be required to complete training and provide input to be eligible to receive stipends and or travel support. So as you see on the slide, participant support costs are budgeted in the following 4 categories: stipends, travel, subsistence, and other. So when budgeting, please consider that all participant support costs must be reasonable and be limited to the days of attendance at the event, plus the actual travel time required to reach the event location by the most direct route available. Participant support costs should also conform with your college's policy, such as using your college's travel policy. NSF accepts those. And you'll need to provide detailed information in the budget justification pertaining to participant support costs. So under stipends, you would need to provide the stipend amount that each participant would receive and what expenses are configured into the provision of that stipend. Under travel, you'd need to explain the purpose of the travel and the time allotted. And again, note that this travel line is separate from Section E travel that I mentioned previously. Travel in Section E is for project personnel, and this Section F is for participant support travel, again, for your participants or trainees of activities you are hosting as part of your grant. Under subsistence, you'll need to provide the amount allotted for subsistence, which can be a food, per diem, or meals, and again, specify the period for which you're providing this. You'll also need to consider that if meals or lodging are furnished without charge or at a nominal cost to the participant, such as having those costs included in a registration fee, then the per diem or subsistence allowance needs to be correspondingly reduced. So as an example, if breakfast and lunch are included as part of your training activity, you can't also then reimburse those participants for the costs of those meals. And as previously mentioned, though that now would definitely be a time to want to have alcohol, NSF funds cannot be used for the purchase of alcohol or entertainment. In terms of other, you would list any other expenses associated for participants and how this is relevant and necessary to the project, such as printing or preparing of training materials. And moving into some additional participant support budget considerations, you absolutely need to specify the number of participants to be engaged in or served by the project. You also need to note that money cannot be transferred in and out of this budget category without NSF approval. So you want to be thoughtful about how you budget for participant support. And in addition to not being able to transfer money in and out of this budget category, you also can't move money around within the specific subcategories of stipends, travel, subsistence without obtaining program director approval. So again, be thoughtful about participant support. It just does require, if you need to move it around, justifying that and seeking approval through FastLane from your program director. And some helpful hints. This category is used, again, primarily for people not at your institution. It must add value to the project. So as an example, if you're planning on hosting a workshop every summer for 30 participants to share teaching strategies, you need to think about the impact it'll have on faculty. The faculty hopefully need to be able to learn something, implement what they've learned, and then through that implementation benefit their students and student learning. So you need to think about how you're measuring the impact of your participant support activities and include those that will only add value to the project. And you can include funds for stipends for high school teachers or students to participate in your project activities. You can also include stipends for college faculty to participate, though budgeting for their travel may be more important. Again, you can budget for food under subsistence if it's associated with the program and the content that they are learning. As a reminder, you must include the estimated number of participants. It will look really odd if you include $50,000 in your budget for participant support, but you don't list the number of participants you expect to serve with those funds. And again, just as mentioned earlier, this is the one category you can't transfer money in and out of without obtaining program director approval. And I think, Mike, we have a question break before I move on to other direct costs. So we can take a few, and Elaine can certainly come on and join me with these.
You know, Ellen, Elaine has answered a number of these in
Great.
the chat, but I'm going to ask you for some clarification. So, you know, where do you put money for food during a workshop? I think you just said that's in the subsistence category, right? So you just make a good estimate of what it is.
Correct. And I guess there's two ways you can do that. If you are going to pay for food for individuals, you would put it under subsistence. If you are going to have your participants buy their own food and give them a stipend, you could include it there.
Okay.
But if I'm going to lay out a buffet around content that I'm giving you, then I would budget that under subsistence. And you do it on a estimated, per person cost per meal.
You know, it's funny, a lot of our questions came up with how in the world you estimate these things if you don't know them. So let me give you an example. I'm putting in travel for a year from now. How could I possibly know the airfare a year from now? What would you do?
It's a tough one. I usually look at what it is and budget a little bit higher. Certainly you want to think that it's reasonable, but again, you do your best estimation. And certainly if you need to move funds around a little bit, again, NSF will approve that. But yes, we use some stock numbers for round trip trips and hope that kind of evens out, that you'll know that you have, I guess if you're budgeting to reimburse participants for travel, it's a little trickier than where you're going. But you try to estimate as best you can.
I think the reviewers who look at this, they look for reasonableness in your
Yes.
budget. I think everyone's nodding their head more than anything else. I think that's the thing. Okay, let's jump to equipment. We're asking for a $32,000 Uprint SE additive manufacturing printer, and it comes with an optional 2-year warranty. Can I budget that warranty into the net cost?
I'm actually going to turn to Elaine on that because I believe I got tripped up on this one last time. I don't want to give misinformation.
Yeah, I'm afraid that probably falls in the same category as maintenance agreements.
Yes.
They're add-ons and they are not allowable.
So you would need to discuss it with your college and see whether they would be willing to pick that up. Occasionally, you will budget for an equipment, the cost of a piece of equipment, and you're never really sure exactly what it's going to cost when the time comes. So sometimes if a price goes down, like I know this happened, has happened as new technology becomes more readily available and competition increases for providing it. And you might have thought you could only buy 3 of them, and you end up with enough money in your budget to buy 4, but you still would need to do just for the equipment and not for the installation and not for maintenance agreements or warranties. And
Right.
but if you need if it has software that is required to make it run, that can be included.
Okay. Yeah, for example, Shelley just asked in the chat, what about installation? You just answered that, and I think I knew that too. College should do the installation. You do not budget for installation. Okay. Ellen, back to you, a quick one. How should we ask for a laptop for the PI? That seems like a good idea.
Well, if it is a laptop that's used for the project, generally, if it's general word processing equipment, that wouldn't be something we would want to include. But if it is something that needs to be used for the project, then that is allowable.
All right, excellent.
Now, I'll give you one example.
Okay.
It might help with that one. We had a principal investigator at our college who had only a desktop computer. And as principal investigator, he had to go to conferences and make presentations and do workshops on behalf of the project. He needed a laptop. The college was not providing faculty with laptops at that point in time. So the project did buy him a laptop for the purpose of doing these workshops and traveling to conferences and that sort of thing. So it really is, it depends on how project specific its use is going to be. That's really the key piece. It can't just be, routine everyday office equipment that everybody has and should have.
All right, cool. Well, thank you both for those responses. We'll have another question break. So if we didn't get your question right now, folks, we'll save them for later. So let's go ahead.
Great, thank you, Mike. So we'll go into other direct costs. So other direct costs that can be included in your proposal budget include materials and supplies, publication costs, consultant services, computer services, and subawards. As with all expenses, you'll need to identify and itemize all anticipated direct costs in your budget justification. And to cover these, so materials and supplies includes items that are project specific and demonstrated as necessary to run the project that cost $5,000 or less. So if you remember, equipment is classified as a total acquisition cost of $5,000 or more, and this category excludes equipment. So as example, if you're purchasing 30 GPS units at a cost of $200 per unit for a total of $6,000, this amount would actually be budgeted under materials and supplies as the individual cost per unit is under $5,000. So again, please note that NSF doesn't allow for the purchase of desks or office equipment or general office supplies that are not being used exclusively for the project. So just as Elaine mentioned, the project specific is the key to this. And materials and supplies need to be directly tied to the project, and items such as plasticware, chemicals, and project-specific office supplies can be budgeted under this category. So again, that's the key, is how specific to the project it is. That's not general utility use. So publications, documentation, and dissemination. So funds may be requested related to the costs for documenting, preparing, publishing, and otherwise making available to others the findings and the products of the work that you've done under the grant. And this generally includes printing reports, editing, documentation, storage of data in databases, and web pages. Moving to consultant services. So consultant services is where you would budget for a person working on the project that is not part of the project staff. So this applies to those individuals that are paid a fee for service as external contractors for their professional services. Note, you would need to identify and justify your need for consultants in the budget and the budget justification, as well as include anticipated cost and length of service. So you need to detail how many days or hours the consultant would work and at what rate of pay. NSF requires that information be given on time and effort. So be specific and don't include a lump sum in your budget without explanation. So for example, when budgeting for the use of a consultant, $6,000 might be 10 days at $500 a day plus $1,000 for travel expenses, or 60 hours at $80 per hour plus $1,200 for travel expenses. You'll just need to include this level of detail and justify your need for the consultant. And again, as Mike has talked about, Elaine has talked about, we're looking at what's reasonable. You can't budget to pay a consultant more than their reasonable and regular rate of pay. Another thing to consider is your college's or your state's purchasing and procurement rules and whether you'll be required to bid out a consultant after receiving grant funds. Note that NSF and reviewers prefer you name your consultants and identify the skills, experience, and value they'll bring to the project. But if you're unable to name a consultant due to purchasing rules, you'll need to include a detailed job description that states the caliber of the person you are seeking to do this scope of work. And as an example, an external evaluator is often budgeted as a consultant to a project. So moving to computer services, the cost of computer services may be requested only if your existing institutional policy is to bill computer services as direct costs. And this category typically refers to costs for computer-based retrievals of scientific or technical data or information necessary to support or inform your work. Justification of established computer service rates at your organization must be included. And again, general purpose computer equipment such as word processing should not be requested. Subawards. So new grantees are not likely to have subawards. So we're going to just briefly cover this category. Subawards are used to fund a discrete portion of work that is carried out by another organization. Elaine referenced this in relation to the question on collaboratives. The subcontracting PI is responsible for the work proposed in the subaward, and the subawardee is responsible for management and oversight of the subaward budget. However, it's the prime institution, which would be your college, that's ultimately responsible for all the project work included in the subaward. Subawards require separate budgets. On the main budget form, you'd list the total annual subaward costs, but your budget justification must include details on the subaward, including a description of the work to be performed and a clear description of the basis of selection for the subawardee. Again, subawardees are named on the budget and have to have a separate budget for each subawardee must be included. And in addition to a list of in order to list a subawardee, the organization needs to be registered in FastLane. So you'd want to make sure that organization is registered and completed as well. For other direct costs, so any other direct costs not previously identified and necessary to support the project must be included here, detailed and itemized in the budget justification. Some examples of potential items budgeted here include conference registration fees, costs associated with preparing exhibits or presentations, or incentives to promote completion of a survey. Again, they should all be proposed in accordance with organizational policies and procedures. And so this is our picture of a total direct cost. So this is the sample form from FastLane that will calculate your total direct costs. This is the easy part. If you've entered all of your numbers correctly, the total direct costs for your grant proposal will be calculated for you. However, your budget's not yet complete, as you will now need to calculate your indirect costs. And I will turn that over to Elaine to cover indirect costs with you.
Every institution receiving a grant award from the NSF must include indirect cost in the budget. This money provides support to the business office and other operations at the college. Including indirect cost in the budget is mandatory. Your college must include in the budget and recover the indirect cost at the federally approved rate that applies to your institution at the time the grant award is made. The rate in effect at the time the grant award is made will apply throughout the life of the grant, even if the college's rate should change in the interim. The same is true for any subawards included in your project budget. Including indirect cost for subawardees is also mandatory. Each subaward will have its own budget and must include a separate budget justification. Each subawardee must use that organization's own indirect cost rate, and this rate is likely to differ from the grantee institution rate. The first thing you need to determine is if your institution already has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate established. These rates change over time, so make certain that the one used in your proposal is current and will not expire before your October proposal submission. Before a grant award can be made to your institution, if your institution has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, you will be required to provide written verification of that rate. Many of you are new to NSF and may not have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate at this time. So what do you do? Excuse me. In this case, you will use the NSF de minimis rate instead. Your institution will not be eligible to apply for a federally negotiated indirect cost rate until your institution becomes a grantee. Once a grantee institution, your college may apply to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to negotiate the rate. However, there is no requirement that this be done. The de minimis rate can be used indefinitely. Negotiated rates result in higher indirect costs, which colleges often desire. Lower indirect costs allow more grant funds to be used in carrying out the project. After receiving a grant award, if your college wants to pursue a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, Mentor Connect has resources to assist your college in this process. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the NSF de minimis rate, should that be the rate that you need to use. NSF states that institutions without a federally negotiated indirect cost rate should use the NSF de minimis rate until a rate for the college is established. The de minimis rate is defined by NSF as 10% of modified total direct costs. Modified total direct costs are determined by subtracting ineligible cost from total direct costs. Now, those total direct costs, that's the bottom line that Ellen just left you off with when she was talking. Ineligible costs are participant support, equipment, and for the most part, subawards. NSF does allow the first $25,000 of a subaward to be included in indirect cost calculations. One point I want to make is that it is important to pay close attention to the impact that indirect costs have on your project budget. Some institutions or community colleges have relatively high indirect cost rates, and this has a big impact on the amount of money that you have to apply to the actual work of the grant, because indirect costs are included within the total grant request amount. Indirect costs are not an addition to. So if you are working on a small grant for institutions new to ATE, your maximum request can be $300,000. That $300,000 must include the indirect cost. Don't get tangled up about this. If you are applying for a grant for the small grant for institutions new to ATE, and you go even one penny over $300,000 with your request, your proposal will not likely be reviewed with other small new to ATE proposals. When you put in a proposal for more than $300,000, it will get kicked automatically into the ATE projects category or funding track for funding consideration. And that is a much more competitive bracket for consideration. And so you don't want to be there unless you need to be there. It's likely that you will find yourself reworking a budget multiple times to accommodate indirect cost. Remember the working spreadsheet that I suggested you create when you prepare your budget? This is where a formula that calculates and adds appropriate indirect cost to your budget can be very helpful. As you sift an expense elsewhere in the budget, the impact on the total grant can be immediately known. Knowing how indirect costs are impacting your overall budget will help you adjust your plan and your scope of work. Here are 3 things to keep in mind as you are grappling with the issue of indirect costs that must be applied to your grant budget. First, institutions with a federally negotiated rate may have more than one federally negotiated indirect cost rate. For example, it's not uncommon for a college to have an on-campus rate and an off-campus rate. The off-campus rate is typically lower. What is important to understand about this is that NSF leaves it up to the college to choose which of their federally negotiated indirect cost rates it uses on a proposal. For this reason, you should explore the options at your college. Another little known fact is that NSF will never ask how the college used the indirect cost that it collects from the grant. A portion of the grant award that the college receives as indirect costs may be used as the institution wishes. College presidents have the latitude to allocate some or all of the indirect collected from grant work back to the project or department that is implementing the project. You may want to explore this possibility with your administration. This is not anything that needs to be reported to NSF, and they will never ask. Last, not budgeting or taking the appropriate amount of indirect cost for your project is considered cost sharing, which is strictly prohibited in the NSF ATE program. So if you had an indirect cost rate of 40% and your college says, "Nah, but we want you to have more money to do the project, so you only need to charge 30, that is considered cost sharing, so you can't do that. Now let's look at how you calculate indirect costs for your budget. The rate is the federally determined percent to be applied, and the base is the total of specific cost in the budget to which that rate applies. And when you have a federally negotiated rate, that letter, that documentation that I told you would have to provide if you're going to get an award, will tell you exactly what cost that rate applies to. And that makes up what they call the base. The rate is predetermined, so for calculating indirect amount for your project, you need to determine that correct base amount for the indirect cost calculation. Indirect costs are typically based on an institution's personnel cost, which may include salaries and wages or a combination of salaries and wages and fringe benefits. In some cases, indirect cost rate may apply to overall cost of college institutional operations. If based on personnel, which is most common, then the base will be the total for budget sections A and B, or perhaps A, B, and C if it includes fringe benefits. On the other hand, if your indirect cost rate is based on all operational cost, then the calculation is a little more complicated. It becomes necessary to determine that total modified direct cost again that I mentioned. Total modified direct costs are determined by subtracting budget items that are not allowed for indirect cost calculation from your total direct cost. In either case, you must enter the base amount for each year on the budget form and the rate to be applied. When you enter that rate, do not put the percent sign or convert to a decimal. If it's a 10%, you put 10. If it's 30, you put 30. And the system is designed to calculate it and convert it to a decimal for that purpose. It can be tricky to get all of this to work out right and not exceed your $300,000, which is yet another good reason not to put budget work off until the last minute. So let's recap. Indirect cost rates are federally negotiated and not determined by NSF. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is the federal agency that makes this determination for grantee institutions if requested to do so. You must include indirect cost in your proposal budget. Use your negotiated rate if you have one, the NSF de minimis rate of 10% if you don't. There is no requirement that an institution have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, so you may use the NSF de minimis rate indefinitely if your institution chooses to do so. The cost basis for indirect cost calculation is specified in your institution's indirect cost rate document, or if the de minimis rate is used, the basis is modified total direct cost. Again, those total modified direct costs are determined by subtracting the ineligible cost from your total direct cost. Expense items not to be included are participant support, equipment, and all but the first $25,000 of subawards. On the budget form, enter the rate without converting it to a percent, without converting your percent to a decimal. The system will do this conversion for you. You use the calculate function once you have entered the base and rate to see if the indirect cost has been correctly calculated. Now we're getting to the bottom line, the real bottom line. When you select the Calculate button in Section J, the system will automatically determine the total direct and indirect costs being requested. Note that budget category K, the small business fee, is not applicable to NSF ATE grants, so you can just skip that section. For NSF ATE proposals, the amount in this section, which is L, is going to match Section J. Your request will be the same as the sum of direct and indirect costs. After completing all of this work, like magic, you have a neatly formatted budget in the FastLane system. You repeat the process for each budget year of the project. And once budgets for all years have been created, then the cumulative budget will be generated automatically by FastLane. The cumulative budget, as the sample shows here, reflects totals for budget categories for all years. The total budget request must not exceed the maximum allowed for the grant for which you are applying. Okay, Mike, I think we're back to question time again.
So Elaine, I'll remind you of something you said. This is almost as fun as filling out your tax forms.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's tax season. We were having a debate whether it was more fun to do your NSF budget or do your income tax returns.
All right, so I'm just teasing on that, but here's the question, right? How in the world do I know what my indirect rate is at my college? Who do I call? Who will know this?
It would be your grants office or grant writer, if you've got one, would certainly know this, or your business office. It would be one of those two places would be where you'd find it. And it will be a written document. I mean, there is an actual document that spells it out if you have one, and it not only gives you the rates, it gives you the different rates that your college may have, and it also has the years to which this rate applies, and you'll know when it expires.
So here's what happened when one of our attendees did this. I'm just paraphrasing his question that appeared in the chat. They asked their VP of Finance what their indirect rate was, and he said it's 0%. So
that means, well, the NSF will not accept that. They will have to use the 10% de minimis rate. They'll have to take the money whether they want it or not.
Okay.
And if they can't figure out anything to do with it, give it to the project and the PI. I'm sure that they can find good uses for it.
Right. Okay, good. That's an important answer. We're getting right near the end of our time, but here's one that has come up several times. Suppose I'm doing an outreach event and I want to put an ad on the local radio station. Where does that money for placing that advertisement on the radio go?
Well, that's a tricky question on a couple of levels, Mike. First of all, you have to be very careful about advertising. All allowable expenditures are governed by OMB circulars for the federal government.
Yes.
And for the type of organization that yours is. So they've got OMB circulars for nonprofits, which most of your public institutions would fall in that category.
Okay.
There are some restrictions on advertising and marketing expenses. And so you need to check and see. Generally, what you want to do is focus on outreach and focus on dissemination of project outcomes in terms of what you're going to be putting out in those kinds of arenas. There's nothing specific that says you can't do that, typically that kind of outreach or use that kind of marketing, but you need to be very careful about how you do that marketing, that it fits within those guidelines and doesn't fall outside the guidelines about what is allowable costs.
All right, perfect. Now, one of our attendees just gave us a hint, and that is a lot of times these things change. You want to make sure that your budget and the numbers you're talking about in the budget justification are aligned with each other. You make sure you have to update one when you update the other. And you can do this during the proposal time, right? You just go back and forth and correct things. All right. I thought that was
one of the biggest mistakes people will make is, for instance, budgeting in the budget for a piece of equipment, and they never talk about in the proposal why they need that piece of equipment, how they're going to use that piece of equipment, how that fits into their work plan. So when you have those kinds of disconnects, or you have money for somebody in the budget and that somebody is not talked about in the proposal, and you don't know what that person is, what their role is, the project description, the 15-page project description needs to be pretty comprehensive. And even though you've got supporting documents that may augment information that's there, if it's not there at all and just shows up in some of the augmented, supplemental type documents, that can cause a problem.
Elaine, as we're wrapping up for today, I think one of the main messages that came through here is attention to detail, and also that you and your colleagues are available as we go forward here, as we get closer to October, to ask questions about the budget. There's a budget tutorial that was referenced. And attendees, did you know that you can save the chat? Right next in the chat, there's those 3 little buttons, and if you click them, it gives you an option to save the chat to your local computer so that you can reference some of the discussion, some of the answers and information that's appeared in the chat. So it's great to do this. I think we're ready to take us towards the end, Elaine.
Okay, thanks, Mag. Now we need to talk about the budget justification. As you can see, the budget form does not allow to provide details about why you're asking or requesting funds and how you determine the dollar amounts that you are requesting. You will prepare a budget justification for this purpose. The budget justification provides an opportunity to demonstrate that your budget is right for your project. It is important that reviewers conclude that you are neither asking for too little nor too much money to implement the scope of work that you described in your proposal. The reason you are requesting funds for various purposes should be logical. Do not ask money for the budget that doesn't directly tie to an activity, something, or someone that you've described in the budget project description, as I just mentioned. It is of great importance that the budget and project description be mutually supportive. You are allowed up to 5 pages for your budget justification. The budget justification is uploaded separately within the budget section and does not count toward any other page limits in preparing the proposal. Each subaward included with the proposal requires a budget and separate budget justification, which can also be up to 5 pages. There's no specific format required for a budget justification. However, there is a preferred format, and a well-organized budget justification will contribute to a more competitive proposal overall. I will share an example in the recommended narrative format. First, some general pointers about budgeting. Think about the cost associated with everything you are planning. Carefully align the activities with corresponding budget amounts that will make the work possible and be reasonable. Research all anticipated costs and don't guess. Take the necessary time to research costs so that you can be very specific about the amounts of money needed and for what purpose. A high level of detail is expected. This is yet another reason not to delay building your budget and preparing your budget justification. It just simply is not a last-minute job. Once your budget justification is prepared, convert your budget justification into a PDF document before uploading. After uploading, always check to see if the document looks right and that you haven't exceeded the page limit. Your budget needs to make sense to reviewers and program officers. So if someone asks you for the money, what would you want to know? How much money? If the total is made up of several costs, such as travel, how much is being requested for each component part of the total? Include details such as hotel rates per night, number of nights, airline ticket price, baggage charge, meals, mileage, parking, whatever the costs are. The more details, the more your reviewers and program officers are going to know that you've really researched this. For whom do you need money? Personnel, participants, consultants? Who are these people? What will they contribute to the project? With what compensation? Over what period of time? What items do you plan to purchase and why? How will materials and supplies and equipment that you are requesting be used to benefit students or participants? Don't request money for equipment or anything else that hasn't been described in the project description as integral to the project. Attention to detail is important to reviewers. They want to know that you've really thought through what it's going to cost to implement the project plan. They want to know the resources have been thoughtfully planned and cost carefully calculated to ensure the success of the project. Now, let's look at a sample budget justification. In this sample narrative budget justification, paragraphs are created to describe costs. Reviewers find it very helpful if you label your paragraphs with alphabet letters that correspond to the NSF budget form. For example, A will be senior personnel and E will be travel. If you are not requesting money in a category, include that alphabet letter anyway and budget line item and indicate not applicable. That lets them know that you considered it, but it doesn't apply to this project and you haven't overlooked it. The print is very small on the screen, but you can access this PowerPoint in the online tutorial we provide for today's webinar, where this example will be easier to read. What I hope you can see today is the level of detail in this example. The format makes it easy for the reviewer to follow. The organization matches that of the budget form itself, and it specifies all of the details and shows that the prospective grantee has put considerable thought and attention into this budget. This slide shows the remainder of that budget justification. Please note that for any consultant included in the budget, which will likely include your evaluator, the rate of pay per hour, total pay, statement outlining the consultant's scope of work is expected. Now I'll share with you some of the common mistakes program officers have encountered with budget justifications and proposals. A biggie is incorrectly budgeting travel. The travel costs may be budgeted in different parts of the budget for different categories of people. In Section E travel, as Ellen pointed out, you should only include employees of your institution. Participant travel, consultants, and other direct costs are three other places where travel may be budgeted. Consultant costs are often budgeted with both time and travel. The other direct cost, other location, which is always an odd one to me, but that's what it's called, is often used to include travel expenses for advisors or others who are not being compensated as consultants, but whose travel is important to the work of the project and will be covered by the grant. The maximum number of pages for the budget justification is 5 pages, which is really generous for a small project. The mistake to avoid here is having a budget justification that is too short. If you have a really short budget justification, it's going to raise a lot of questions because you need to justify every amount that you request. Details show that you have done the research and calculations necessary to make your request as precise and realistic as possible. You want to organize your justification to align with the budget form and organize it for clarity. Use the same sections and labeling as on the NSF budget form. That's what's preferred. Don't list an amount to be paid to a consultant without specifying the rate of pay per hour or by day, total hours and days to be worked, and a clear statement of what that scope of work is going to be for that person. If your budget includes overload pay for faculty, you must explain who will be paid in overload, how much overload will be paid, for what time period, and for what scope of work. You must also reference the college's policy and procedures for faculty overload pay that will be followed in making the payment. Don't be vague. Provide a list of specific materials and supplies that you anticipate purchasing and the estimated cost per item, and indicate how each item will support the project. Be detailed in requesting travel funds. Why are you traveling? What will be accomplished or shared with others at the event? What is the breakdown of costs associated with the travel? Trips to conferences for the purpose of dissemination other than the ATEPI conference are usually considered more appropriate later in a project after you've had time to actually accomplish something. Adjunct faculty are neither participants nor consultants for your project. Part-time faculty should be budgeted in Section B under other personnel. Now, Mike, I think we wanted to see if there were any other questions. I know we're running a little short on time.
You know, we've done a great job, Elaine, that is Ellen has, of catching up with the questions in the chat box. So I think in the interest of time, We'll make sure that we let attendees know. I know our emails are coming up that you're available for questions and follow-up. But I think we're caught up, so I'd like us to continue, and let's go ahead and wrap up the webinar.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. This is Emery, and I just wanted to give you all a few webinars that we have done. The evaluation crash course for non-evaluators. We've already had that live, but it is on our website. Our next webinar will be the tips and tricks for your forms preparation. There will also be a tutorial that will be available after that webinar as well. On that, and they will all also be on our website recorded there. This is the where you can contact us. Any questions that we didn't get to, please send those to the Mentor Connect at fttc.edu, or you can send it to my email address. I think Ellen put that in the chat box as well, and we will get those questions answered. There's so much material to cover with this budget, and we try to do it as quickly and as concise as we can, but it is hard to get it all in. So please don't hesitate to call us and let us know with that. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike. We really would love for y'all to fill out an evaluation survey. There's 6 questions. You'll need to scroll down to answer each of the 6. It really does help us out a lot. So I'm going to turn that over to Mike right now to launch that and end the webinar.
And thank you, Emery. So folks, before you run off and check your email or check your stock prices, just take a moment and answer these brief questions. You will have to use the slider on the right-hand side to slide down to respond to the questions. And thanks, this helps improve our webinar series. So I'm going to ask the panelists to turn off their cameras. We'll be staying here for a few minutes looking at the chat window. Thank you. I see everyone starting to fill out that brief poll at the end, and we appreciate that. And please join me in thanking both Elaine, Ellen, and Emery today. Excellent presentation, ton of details. Mentor Connect forever. That officially ends our broadcast today. I'm going to turn off the recording, but I'll leave the poll up and the chat window up for a few more minutes. Thank you again.